a giant rancher begged for milk for his dying baby. And in front of the whole church, a grieving, heavy-set woman stepped forward with an offer no one saw coming. In a land where snow bit harder than kindness, she gave the child life with her own hands, never guessing it would lead her into a battle for land, survival, and love. But the rancher's enemies would stop at nothing, burning barns, delivering threats, circling like wolves in the night. And as the danger closed in, the woman who once had nothing found herself willing to risk everything for the baby she now called her own. Can she protect the child and the man who trusted her before the land and their lives are taken forever? Before we begin, share a piece of your world in the comments, your city, your energy. It's a powerful thing, being part of something bigger than ourselves. A hush fell over the church as Clara held Birdie close, the infant's tiny fingers clutching at her shawl. Through the open doors, snowflakes danced in the winter air, dusting the wooden pews with white quan. The congregation stood frozen, their Sunday best covered in a fine powder of snow. As they watched this intimate moment unfold, Clara's heart thundered in her chest. But her hands remained steady as she adjusted her position to better support the baby's head. Birdie's desperate cries had quieted two soft whimpers as she nursed, her little cheeks flushed with fever. The familiar ache in Clara's chest, the one that had haunted her since losing her own child, began to ease, replaced by a warmth she thought she'd never feel again. Luke Harlan knelt beside the pew, his broad shoulders curved protectively around them both. His deep brown eyes never left his daughter's face, watching every movement with the intensity of a father who'd already lost too much. The silver crucifix hanging at the altar caught the weak winter light, casting gentle shadows across his weathered features. "There now," Clara whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The sound of her voice seemed to break the spell that held the congregation motionless. Several women turned away, pressing handkerchiefs to their lips. Others shuffled their feet on the wooden floor, the boards creaking beneath them. Reverend Thompson cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give them some privacy," he suggested quietly, ushering the remaining churchgoers toward the door. The shuffle of boots and rustle of skirts gradually faded, leaving only the whisper of wind and the soft sounds of Birdie's feeding. When the baby finally released her hold, Clara carefully wrapped her back in the quilt, taking care to tuck the edges snugly around her tiny frame. The fever still burned in Birdie's small body, but her breathing seemed easier now, more peaceful. Luke's hands trembled as he reached for his daughter. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She's been crying since Dawn wouldn't take the goat's milk no matter what I tried." Clara smoothed her skirts, trying to hide her own trembling. "No thanks needed, Mr. Harlan. Any woman with a heart would have done the same." "No," he said firmly, looking straight into her eyes. "They wouldn't. You saw them all turn away." He glanced down at Birdie, who had drifted into an exhausted sleep. "Miss Riggins, I know it's a lot to ask, but—" He paused, searching for words. "Would you consider coming out to the ranch? Just until she's stronger." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Clara knew what people would see a single woman going to live at a widower's ranch, especially one with Luke's mixed heritage. She could already hear Mrs. Parsons, her landlady, clucking her tongue in disapproval. But Birdie stirred in her sleep, making those tiny sounds that only babies make, and Clara felt her heart twist. This child needed her. What was reputation compared to a life? Outside, the snow fell harder, and through the church windows, Clara could see the street emptying as people hurried home to their warm hearths. The wind rattled the window panes, reminding her of the harsh winter ahead. "Your ranch," she said carefully. "It's out past Dry Creek, isn't it?" "Near the Apache reservation." Luke nodded, his expression guarded. It's not much to look at, but it's good land. Clean water from the spring, sturdy roof over our heads. He hesitated. I know it's far from town, and I can't offer much in the way of comfort, but I'll come. Clara interrupted softly. Not for you, Mr. Harlan, but for her. She touched Bertie's cheek gently. No child should suffer if there's something to be done about it. The relief that flooded Luke's face made him look younger, softening the worry lines around his eyes. I've got the wagon outside. We should leave soon, before the snow gets worse. He stood, offering his free hand to help her up from the pew. Do you need to collect your things? Clara thought of her small room at the boarding house, of Mrs. Parsons's sour face, and the lonely evenings spent staring at her mending. Just a few items, she said. It won't take long. As they stepped out of the church into the swirling snow, Clara pulled her shawl tighter. The street was nearly deserted now, though she could feel eyes watching from behind frosted windows. Luke walked beside her, his long stride shortened to match hers. Bertie bundled securely against his chest. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way to the boarding house, the only sounds of the winter wind and their own breathing. Clara glanced up at Luke's profile, stern and strong against the gray sky. What was she doing? Agreeing to go with this near stranger? But then Bertie made a soft sound, and Clara knew her decision was already made. She'd lost one child to Winters. Cruel grip. She wouldn't stand by and watch another slip away, not when she could help. Whatever tomorrow might bring, today she had chosen hope over fear, life over loneliness. The rest would sort itself out in time. Note, this segment fully covers the key moment of Clara nursing Bertie in the church and Luke asking her to come to his ranch, including the immediate aftermath of her decision. The scene maintains the emotional depth and period-appropriate details while keeping the focus on the characters, feelings, and motivations. The wind bit sharply as Luke and Clara made their way from the church toward the livery stable. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter, watching as Luke cradled Bertie against his chest, shielding her from the bitter cold. Their boots crunched through fresh snow, leaving twin trails behind them. We need to stop at Mrs. Parsons' boarding house. First, Clara said, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I won't take but a minute to gather my things. Luke nodded, adjusting his hold on Bertie. Of course. Lead the way, Miss Riggins. The boarding house loomed ahead, its weather-beaten clapboards gray against the white sky. Clara climbed the creaking steps and pushed open the heavy door. Warmth from the coal stove washing over her. Mrs. Parsons stood in the hallway, her thin face pinched with disapproval. So you're leaving then, the landlady sneered, watching as Clara hurried up the narrow stairs, running off with the first man who asks, Are you? Useless girl, just like I always said. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high as she entered her small room. Her belongings fit easily into one carpet bag, 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a handful of letters, and her sewing kit. She grabbed her extra shawl from its peg, the wool worn thin at the edges. Back downstairs, Mrs. Parsons stood with her arms crossed. Don't come crying back here when it all goes wrong. Clara paused at the door. I won't be back, Mrs. Parsons. You can be sure of that. She stepped out into the swirling snow, letting the door slam behind her. Luke waited with his bay horse, already saddled and stamping restlessly in the cold. He tied Clara's carpetbag behind the saddle, then turned to help her mount. His hands were strong and steady as he boosted her up, careful not to jostle Bertie, who was now secured in a sling across his chest. It's a good 3 hours to the ranch, he said, swinging up behind her. Maybe longer in this weather. He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward, hooves breaking through the crusty snow. They rode in silence at first, the town falling away behind them. The rutted road disappeared under deepening drifts, forcing them to pick their way carefully. After a while, Luke cleared his throat. The bay's name is Thunder, he offered. raised him from a colt. "He's a fine horse," Clara replied, grateful for the attempt at conversation. When Luke leaned forward to guide Thunder around a fallen branch, his scarf slipped down. Clara caught a clear glimpse of his features, the high cheekbones and proud nose speaking clearly of his Apache heritage. The snow eventually eased, though the wind continued to moan across the open prairie. Near dusk, they reached a frozen creek, its banks lined with skeletal cottonwoods. "We should rest a spell," Luke said, reining Thunder to a stop. "Horse needs a breather, and Birdie's probably hungry." He helped Clara dismount, her legs stiff from hours in the saddle. While Luke tended to Thunder, Clara settled on a fallen log and took Birdie in her arms. The baby's face was red from the cold, despite her wrappings. "There now, little one," Clara murmured, arranging her shawl for privacy as Birdie began to nurse. Almost without thinking, she started to hum an old hymn, one her mother had sung to her. Birdie's tiny hand curled around Clara's finger as she fed. Luke kept his distance, but Clara could feel his relief when Birdie's hungry cries quieted. The sun was setting by the time they mounted up again, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of purple and gold, purple and gold. Darkness had fallen completely when Luke finally pointed ahead. "There's my line shack. We'll stop there for the night, tits. Too dangerous to push on to the main house in the dark." The small cabin emerged from the gloom, its single window dark. Luke quickly had a fire going in the pot-bellied stove while Clara changed and fed Birdie again. The wind found every crack in the walls, making the flames dance. "It ain't much," Luke said, heating up a pot of beans and cutting thick slices of bread, "but it's warm enough." They ate in comfortable silence, Birdie sleeping peacefully in a nest of blankets near the stove. After the dishes were cleaned, Luke settled back in his chair, his face troubled in the flickering light. "I should tell you," he said slowly, "about Cerebrity's mother." He stared into the fire. "The pregnancy was hard on her from the start. Doctor said she wasn't strong enough, but she wanted that baby so bad." His voice roughened. "She held on just long enough to name her Birdie after her own mama. Then she was gone." Clara's heart ached for the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harlan." He nodded, then seemed to force himself to continue. "There's something else you should know. There's trouble brewing with the cattle syndicate. They've been pushing hard to buy up all the small ranches hereabouts. Some folks who refused have had mysterious accidents." He looked directly at Clara. "I won't blame you if you want to turn back tomorrow. I made my choice," Clara said firmly. "Birdie needs me, and I aim to stay as long as she does." Luke spread their bedrolls on either side of the stove, keeping a respectful distance. The wind rattled the shack's walls, but the fire's warmth held the worst of the cold at bay. Clara lay awake for a long time, listening to Birdie's soft breathing and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Luke guided Thunder down the last stretch of snow-covered trail. Clara held Birdie close, the baby bundled against the morning chill. Through gaps in the bare trees, she caught glimpses of a clearing ahead. Finally, they emerged into an open space where a sturdy log house stood proudly against the brightening sky. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, dancing in the crisp air. "Home," Luke said simply, his breath visible in the cold. Two men appeared from the barn, stamping their boots and pulling off work gloves as Luke helped Clara dismount. Both were weathered by sun and wind, their clothes showing honest wear from ranch work. "Boys," Luke called out, "this here's Miss Clara Riggins. She'll be caring for Birdie." He turned to Clara. "These are my hands, Tom Weber and Bill Collins. Known them both since we were boys." Tom, the taller of the two, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, right glad you're here for the little one." Bill nodded in agreement, already moving to take Thunder's reins. "I'll see to your horse, Luke." The house welcomed them with blessed warmth. The rich smell of coffee, filling the air. A pot bubbled on the cast-iron stove, and a fire crackled in the river-rocked fireplace. Clara's frozen fingers began to thaw as she looked around the main room. Simple furniture, well-maintained, spoke of care rather than luxury. Hand-woven blankets draped the chairs, their patterns telling stories she couldn't yet read. "Your rooms." "This way," Luke said, leading her down a short hallway. He pushed open a door to reveal a spare but comfortable bedroom. A sturdy bed with a colorful quilt dominated the space, while a rocking chair sat in the corner near the window. "It ain't fancy, but it's warm enough." "It's perfect," Clara said softly, setting her carpetbag beside the bed. The room was larger than her space at the boarding house and far more welcoming. "I'll let you get settled," Luke said. "Coffee's hot when you're ready, and I asked Tom's wife to send over some breakfast fixings." Clara took a moment to change Birdie and settle her in the cradle Luke had brought in. Then she smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, and made her way to the kitchen. Luke sat at the heavy oak table, papers spread before him as he nursed. "A cup of coffee. There's eggs and bacon keeping warm on the stove," he said, looking up, "and biscuits in the cloth there." He waited until she'd filled a plate before speaking again, his voice heavy. "Miss Riggins, there's something you should know, being here." Clara sat down across from him, noting the worry lines around his eyes. "What is it?" "The CCC cattle syndicate's been causing trouble." He pushed a legal-looking document across the table. "Their lawyer claims the spring that waters my north pasture belongs to them, not me. Says it wasn't included in my mother's original allotment." "Your mother's allotment?" Clara asked carefully. Luke's jaw tightened. She was Apache. When the government divided the reservation lands, she received this parcel. "Married my Irish father and built this place together." His hands spread over the paper. "Everything I own came from her, the land, the water rights, even these walls. It's Birdie's inheritance." Clara absorbed this quietly, tucking away both the information and the emotion behind it, and now they're trying to take the spring. "Without that water, half my grazing land becomes useless. Can't run cattle without water." He folded the paper with deliberate care. "They're hoping to starve me out, force me to sell cheap." The day settled into a gentle rhythm after breakfast. Clara fed Birdie, then discovered a torn curtain in the main room. She found her sewing kit and settled in the patch of sunlight by the window, watching through the glass as Luke worked with the horses in the corral. His movements were sure and patient, speaking a language of gesture and trust with the animals. The afternoon light was fading when Luke came in. Bringing the sharp cold with him, Clara had started supper a simple meal of salt, pork, beans, and the last of the morning's biscuits. They ate together at the kitchen table, Birdie sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. "My mother loved this time of day," Luke said unexpectedly, his voice soft with memory. "Said it was when the world held its breath between light and dark." He looked around the familiar room. "Everything here has her touch the way the house faces the sunrise. The herbs she planted by the door, even the stories in those blankets she wove." Clara rocked Birdie later that evening, the cradle runners making soft sounds against the wooden floor. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkened prairie, their voices rising and falling like wild music. The room felt surprisingly comfortable, already wrapping her in a sense of belonging that both welcomed and worried her. "It's just temporary," she whispered to herself, even as her heart disagreed. "Just until Birdie's bigger and stronger." But as she prepared for bed, the sound of the wind in the eaves and the distant coyote song felt oddly like a lullaby, as if the land itself was welcoming her home. The week unfurled in measured winter days, each one following its own gentle rhythm. Clara rose before dawn, when the ranch house was silent except for Birdie's soft morning sounds. The infant had grown stronger, her cheeks filling out and gaining a rosy glow that made Clara's heart swell with quiet joy. morning chores became a dance between her and Luke, while she fed Bertie in the rocker by the kitchen stove. He would kindle the fire and set coffee to boil. Some days, Clara mixed bread dough in the big ceramic bowl, kneading it with practiced hands while Luke split logs in the yard. The steady thunk of his axe kept time with her movements. When the midweek thaw came, softening the packed snow and ice, Luke announced they needed supplies. "Wagon should make it to town now," he said over breakfast, spreading butter on a thick slice of Clara's bread. "Reckon you and Bertie might want to come along." Clara nodded, already mentally listing what they needed. The flowers running low and were nearly out of lamp oil. The wagon rattled down the rutted road, its wooden wheels leaving deep tracks in the softening snow. Clara sat beside Luke on the high seat, Bertie bundled warmly against her chest. The winter sun cast long shadows from the bare trees, and their breath rose in soft clouds. The mercantile's bell jingled as they entered. Clara breathed in the familiar smells of coffee beans, leather, and dry goods. But the welcome feeling faded as heads turned and conversations died. Luke kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, but Clara heard the whispers clearly enough. "Half-breed," someone muttered. Another voice answered too low to catch. Clara's jaw tightened. She watched Luke methodically gather their supplies: flour, coffee, lamp oil, a few other necessities. His movements were controlled, deliberate, as if he could shield himself from the stares with quiet dignity. Mr. Peterson, the store owner, took Luke's money without meeting his eyes. Clara noticed his fingers barely touched Luke's palm during the exchange, as if afraid of contamination. She hugged Bertie closer, anger burning in her chest at their ignorance. Outside, the winter air felt cleaner, but their relief was short-lived. A man in a fine wool coat approached, his boots gleaming despite the muddy snow. His smile reminded Clara of a snake she'd once seen, smooth and dangerous. "Mr. Harlan," the man said, tipping his hat. "Miss Riggins. I'm Jonathan Hanley, representing the C Cattle Syndicate." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "I have here documentation showing your spring was omitted in error from your deed. A simple oversight, easily corrected with your signature." Face hardened. "My mother's allotment included that spring. It's recorded clear as day in the federal papers." Federal papers. "Ah, but there seems to be some confusion in the original survey." Hanley's smile never wavered. "The syndicate is prepared to offer fair compensation for the inconvenience." "Nothing to discuss," Luke said flatly. "Spring's mine by right. And law? I won't be signing anything." Hanley's eyes cooled. "Consider carefully, Mr. Harlan. The syndicate has considerable influence with the territorial courts. A long legal battle could be ... costly." Clara felt Luke tense beside her. Before he could respond, she stepped forward. "Mr. Hanley, we need to get this little one home before the cold sets in. Good day to you." She touched Luke's arm gently, and after a moment, he turned toward the wagon. The ride home was heavy with unspoken words. Luke's hands were tight on the reins, and even Bertie seemed to sense the tension, tossing quietly against Clara's shoulder. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the snow-covered hills in shades of pink and gold. After supper, Clara noticed Luke had slipped outside. She found him standing in the yard, his face turned toward the dark hills where the disputed spring lay. Stars were beginning to appear in the deep blue sky, and his breath rose like smoke in the cold air. She walked to stand beside him, adjusting her shawl against the chill. For a long moment, they just stood there, sharing the silence. "Bertie will grow up with her father's land under her feet," Clara said finally, her voice soft but firm. "This place is her birthright, same as it was your mother's." Luke nodded, but his shoulders remained heavy with worry. His next words came slowly, weighted with generations of struggle. "My mother used to say, 'The land remembers who belongs to it.' Said you could feel it in your bones if you listened right. He turned to look at Clara, his eyes reflecting starlight. I aim to make sure Birdie gets that chance. The night was crisp and clear around them, filled with the distant song of coyotes and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Clara felt the truth of his words settle into her own bones. This land did remember, and it would take more than fancy lawyers and cattle syndicates to break its bonds with those who loved it. True. 3 days after their encounter with Hanley, the morning stillness broke with the sound of hoofbeats. Clara looked up from where she was hanging laundry, her hands pausing on a damp sheet. A male rider appeared through the trees, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Luke emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. The rider dismounted, pulling an official-looking envelope from his saddlebag. Mr. Harlan, from the county seat. Clara watched Luke's face darken as he read the letter. Birdie dozed in her basket nearby, wrapped snug against the winter chill. When the rider departed, she moved closer, touching Luke's arm. What is it? Hearing in 2 weeks. His voice was tight. About the spring rights. Clara folded the sheet she was holding, considering. Maybe we shouldn't wait for the hearing, she said carefully. We could go to the county seat ourselves. Look at the original records. Luke frowned. Ranch needs tendon. The herd, I can watch things here, a voice called. They turned to see Tom Wheeler, one of Luke's most trusted hands, leading his horse from the corral. The older cowhand had worked the ranch since Luke's father's time. Few days won't hurt nothing. Weather's holding steady. Inside the house, Clara packed quickly while Luke consulted with Tom about the herd. She folded extra blankets, dried beef, coffee, and hardtack into a provision sack. Birdie watched from her basket, occasionally cooing at the activity. Might take 2 days, depending on the roads, Luke said when he came in. He pulled out a worn map, spreading it on the kitchen table. Clara leaned close, studying the route he traced with his finger. The distance looked considerable. We'll need to camp 1 night at least, she noted, already mentally preparing what Birdie would need. She had learned that babies required planning, especially in winter travel. They set out just after noon, the wagon creaking under their weight and supplies. Clara sat in the back, sheltered by the canvas cover with Birdie in her arms. Luke handled the reins with careful attention, avoiding the worst of the frozen ruts. The sun was low when they reached a small pond. It surfaced a sheet of clouded ice. Luke pulled the wagon into a protected hollow nearby. Best stop here, he said, studying the darkening sky. Too risky traveling these roads after dark. They worked together to make camp, falling into an easy rhythm. Luke gathered wood, while Clara spread bedrolls near where they'd build the fire. She fed Birdie as Luke got the flames going, the warmth slowly pushing back the evening chill. Over a simple supper of coffee and dried meat, Luke grew contemplative. The firelight carved deep shadows in his face as he stared into the flames. My mother used to sit by the fire like this, he said softly. She'd teach me words and Apache names for the stars, the animals, the land. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, listening. Birdie slept peacefully between them, swaddled in her blankets. She'd tell me the land was sacred, Luke continued. Said it held the stories of all who came before. Said we were just part of its longer tale. He picked up a stick, stirred the embers. When the government was giving out allotments, she made sure this piece was recorded proper. Said it was important to have paper proof, even though the land already knew who it belonged to. She sounds like a wise woman, Clara said softly. Luke nodded. She was, taught me to read both English and Apache. Said knowledge was a weapon. Same as any gun. He looked up at Clara. That's why you're right about checking those records. She'd have done the same. The night deepened around them, stars appearing in the clear winter sky. Clara felt the weight of history in Luke's words. In the land beneath them, This wasn't just about a spring or a ranch anymore. It was about belonging, about roots that ran deep as the oldest trees. "Get some sleep," Luke said finally. "Long ride tomorrow." Clara settled into her bedroll, Bertie snug against her chest. The fire popped softly, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Despite the cold, she felt warm not just from the flames, but from something deeper. This land was beginning to feel like home, and she understood now why Luke would fight so hard to keep it. As she drifted off, she heard Luke adding wood to the fire, his movements careful and quiet. The sound was comforting, like the steady heartbeat of the land itself. Keeping watch through the long winter night, the winter sun hung high when their wagon rolled into the county seat. The town sprawled larger than Dry Creek, its main street, lined with impressive brick buildings instead of wooden facades. Clara held Bertie close as Luke helped them down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. "Records office should be this way," Luke said, pointing toward a square brick building with tall windows. A brass plaque beside the heavy door read Territorial Records and Deeds. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes and tied bundles of documents. An elderly man looked up from a large desk, his silver spectacles catching the light from the window. "Mr. Whitaker." Luke removed his hat. "I'm Luke Harlan. This is Miss Riggins and my daughter, Bertie." The clerk's eyes brightened with recognition. "Harlan. Sarah Running Water's boy?" "Yes, sir. You knew my mother." "Indeed, I did." Whitaker stood slowly, his movements careful but purposeful. "Fine woman, your mother. Sharp as a tack when it came to understanding the importance of proper documentation." He gestured to some wooden chairs. "Please, sit. Tell me what brings you here." Clara settled into a chair, adjusting Bertie in her arms while Luke explained about the cattle syndicate's claim on the spring. Whitaker's bushy eyebrows drew together as he listened. "Shameful business, these land grabs," he muttered. "Give me some time. I recall something about that property." He disappeared between the towering shelves. They waited as the afternoon. Light shifted through the windows. Bertie dozed, then woke hungry. Clara fed her discreetly while Luke paced, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Nearly 3 hours later, Whitaker emerged clutching a large packet wrapped in oilcloth. His eyes gleamed with triumph. Knew it was here somewhere. He laid the bundle on his desk, carefully untying the string. Inside was a treaty document, its edges weathered, but the text still clear. Whitaker put on his spectacles and traced his finger down the page. "Here we are. The spring and surrounding 100 acres were granted in perpetuity to the family group represented by Sarah Running Water, with all water rights explicitly included." He looked up at Luke. "Your mother made certain this was properly recorded." She understood the value of water in this territory. Clara had pulled out her small notebook and pencil. "I copy the exact wording?" she asked. "Certainly, my dear." Whitaker adjusted the lamp on his desk to give her better light, while Clara carefully transcribed the crucial passages. Luke studied the original document. His fingers traced his mother's signature, written in both English and Apache characters. "The syndicate won't like this," Whitaker warned, refolding the treaty. "They've been buying up water rights all through the territory. They'll likely try to argue the treaty's validity or find some technical error in the filing." "Let them try," Clara said, more fiercely than she intended. Both men turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks warm. "I mean, the language is very clear. And there's your seal on the deed packet as well." Whitaker smiled. "Indeed there is, Miss Riggins. Indeed there is." The sun was setting when they finally left the records office. The temperature had dropped sharply, and Bertie began to fuss. "I found a modest boarding house a few streets over, its faded sign promising clean rooms, fair rates." The landlady, a thin woman with kind eyes, showed them to two small adjoining rooms. "Supper's almost ready, if you're wanting any," she offered. "Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread." In their rooms, Clara changed Bertie while Luke counted out coins on the dresser. She pretended not to notice his frown as he tucked the depleted purse back into his coat. "$7.25 left," he said quietly. "Enough to get home, but not much more." They went down to the dining room where the landlady had set places at the long table. The cornbread was fresh and the beans well seasoned. Clara ate one-handed, keeping Bertie settled in her other arm. "We need to get these papers home safe," Luke said, his voice low. He glanced at the oilcloth packet propped beside him. "There. No good to us if something happens to them on the way back." Clara nodded, thinking of the rough road ahead. "We could hide them in Bertie's blankets," she suggested. "No one would think to look there." "Good idea." Luke broke off another piece of cornbread. "We should leave at first light tomorrow. Storms coming, I can feel it in the air." Back in their rooms, Clara copied her notes again, making sure every word matched the original. The treaty's language swam before her tired eyes, in perpetuity, ... all water rights, legal heirs, and assigns. She knew these words might be all that stood between Luke and the loss of his land, through the thin wall. She could hear Luke moving around in his room, his footsteps solid and reassuring. Bertie was already asleep in the drawer they'd padded, with blankets for a makeshift cradle. Clara looked at the tiny face, peaceful in sleep, and thought about futures, the one they were fighting for, and the one the syndicate wanted to take away. The night deepened outside their windows. Clara tucked her notebook safely away and prepared for bed, knowing tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The precious treaty documents lay hidden in Bertie's spare blankets, ready for the journey home. Whatever came next, they had what they'd weighed. Come for proof of Luke's rights to the land that was his birthright. Morning brought a bitter chill that settled deep in their bones. Frost sparkled across the wagon seat like scattered diamonds, forcing Luke to lay down a blanket before Clara could climb up with Bertie. The little one was bundled tight against the cold, only her pink nose visible beneath the layers of wool. "We should make it home before dark," Luke said, checking the oilcloth packet one last time before tucking it securely beneath Bertie's blankets. His breath came out in white puffs as he spoke. "Weather's holding for now, but those clouds don't look friendly." Clara nodded, settling Bertie more comfortably in her arms as Luke clicked to the horses. The wagon wheels creaked as they pulled away from the boarding house, the sound sharp in the frozen morning air. Main Street was quiet, with only a few early risers hurrying between buildings. Collars turned up against the wind. They made steady progress through the morning, stopping once to rest the horses and feed Bertie. Clara's back ached from the constant jolting of the wagon, but she kept her discomfort to herself. The precious treaty papers remained safely hidden, though she found herself checking them whenever they paused near midday. They rounded a bend in the road and came upon a group of riders. 5 men sat their horses in a loose circle, and Clara felt Luke stiffen beside her. She recognized Mr. Hanley, the syndicate's lawyer, by his fine coat. The other men wore gun belts and hard expressions. No one spoke as Luke guided the wagon. Past them, the only sounds were the crunch of wheels on frozen ground and the jingle of harness brass. The riders watched in silence, their eyes following the wagon until it disappeared around the next bend. "Friends of yours." Clara tried to keep her tone light, but her heart was racing. Luke's jaw was set tight. "Syndicate men. Probably figured we'd gone to the county seat." He glanced at Bertie's blankets where the treaty lay hidden. "Good thing they don't know what we found." The afternoon wore on, and the sky grew increasingly heavy with clouds. The air took on that peculiar stillness that often preceded snow, and Clara could smell moisture on the wind. Bertie grew fussy as the temperature dropped further, and Clara hummed softly to soothe her an old hymn her mother used to sing. "That's pretty," Luke said after a while. "What is it?" "Come Thou Fount," Clara replied. "My mama taught it to me when I was small." She hesitated, then added, "It always seemed to call my baby, too." Luke's expression softened. It was the first time she'd mentioned her lost child since that day in the church. "Seems to work on Bertie just fine," he said gently. Darkness was falling when they finally spotted the ranch house, a welcome rectangle of warm lamplight in the gathering gloom. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air, promising warmth within. The cowhands had kept the home fires burning in their absence. Luke helped Clara down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. She hurried inside, with Bertie while he saw to the horses. The familiar scent of wood smoke and coffee wrapped around her like a blanket as she crossed the threshold. Later, after Bertie was fed and sleeping soundly in her cradle, Luke carefully pried up a floorboard. Beneath his bed, he pulled out a battered tin box that had once held tobacco and placed their copied treaty inside, along with Clara's detailed notes. "Not many folks know about this hiding spot," he said, replacing the board. "My mother showed it to me when I was young. Said sometimes papers were more precious than gold out here." Clara sat in the rocking chair by the fire, working warmth back into her cold fingers. She was a wise woman. That she was. Luke straightened up and looked at Clara, his expression serious. "I want to thank you, Clara, not just for helping with the records, but for everything. Coming out here with hardly any notice. Taking care of Bertie. Facing down those syndicate men today without flinching." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "Truth is, I can't imagine this place without you now." Clara felt warmth flood her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands. Her heart beat faster, but she couldn't find the words to respond. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Clara rose and went to look out. Tiny white flakes were just beginning to spiral down from the dark sky. "Snow's starting," she said softly. Luke came to stand beside her at the window. Together they watched the snow fall, each lost in their own thoughts about futures and possibilities, about homes and hearts, and about the precious proof of belonging now safely hidden beneath their feet. The snow fell thick and steady through the night, blanketing the ranch in deep white drifts. By morning, the world outside the windows was transformed into a hushed landscape of white mounds and ice-laden branches. Clara woke early, as usual, to tend to Bertie, finding the house surprisingly cold despite the banked fire. While feeding the baby, she noticed a sharp draft whistling through a gap near the window frame. The icy air made Bertie squirm and fuss. After settling the little one back in her cradle, Clara approached Luke, who was stoking the morning fire. "Have you got any old newspapers?" she asked, rubbing her arms against the chill. Luke looked up, puzzled. "Reckon there's some in that crate by the door. Why? I'll show you." Clara retrieved the papers and demonstrated how to roll them tight and wedge them into the gaps around the window frame. "My father taught me this trick. It helps keep the warmth in." Luke watched with interest, then helped her seal the other windows. The difference was immediate. The bitter draft disappeared, leaving the room noticeably warmer. "Never thought of that," he admitted. "My mother had her ways of keeping warm, but this is clever." With the snow keeping them inside, Clara turned her attention to other household matters. The pantry was a jumble of supplies, with dried beans mixed among coffee tins and flour sacks stacked precariously. She spent the morning reorganizing while Luke played with Bertie, whose happy gurgles filled the house. "Everything has its place," Clara explained, showing Luke how she'd arranged similar items together and placed the most used supplies within easy reach. "Saves time when you're cooking, and nothing gets forgotten in the back." The second day of snow brought a peaceful rhythm to the household. Clara noticed Birdie seemed more content, her cheeks growing pleasantly plump. The baby's smiles came more frequently now, especially when Luke made silly faces at her during feeding time. "She's getting stronger," Clara observed, touching one. Rosy cheek as Birdie nursed. "See how her colors improved." Luke's expression softened as he watched them. "Thanks to you," he said quietly. On the third morning, they woke to clear skies and brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle. After breakfast, Luke pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. "Need to check the herd," he explained, stamping his boots. "Make sure none wandered off in the storm." After he rode out, Clara settled into the quiet routine of the day. She gathered scraps of fabric. She'd been collecting pieces of old shirts, a faded quilt square, even a length of soft wool from her own shawl. Working steadily through the afternoon, she pieced them together into a colorful blanket for Birdie. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink. When Luke's horse thundered into the yard, Clara looked up from her sewing to see him stride. Through the door, his expression grim. "Joe Miller rode over while I was checking the south pasture," he said without preamble, hanging up his coat. "Says he saw 6 syndicate riders heading this way, all of them armed. They were asking questions about the ranch." Clara's hands stilled on the blanket. "When?" "This morning." Luke ran a hand through his hair. Joe said they looked like they meant business. They ate their supper in tense silence, the only sounds Birdie's occasional coos and the scrape of spoons against bowls. Clara couldn't help glancing at the floorboard where the treaty lay hidden. Luke's eyes kept straying to the window, though. Nothing moved in the darkness beyond. That night, Clara lay awake in her bed, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and Birdie's soft breathing from the cradle. The house creaked and settled in the cold. Then she heard the muffled thud of hoofbeats passing in the dark, somewhere beyond the barn. She held her breath, counting. One rider, then another, and another, moving slow and deliberate through the snow. She slipped from her bed and patted. To Birdie's cradle, laying one hand gently on the sleeping baby. In the next room, she heard Luke's floorboards creak. He was awake too. Listening to the night riders pass, the hoofbeats faded into the distance, but the tension remained, thick as the snow outside. Clara stood by the cradle until her feet grew, numb with cold, watching over Birdie as the moon cast long shadows across the floor. Eventually, she returned to her bed, but sleep was long in coming. The sound of those horses in the dark played over and over in her mind like a warning drum. Beating in the distance, tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but for now, all they could do was wait and watch. The pale winter sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Clara woke to the acrid smell of smoke. She rushed to the window, Birdie still sleeping soundly in her cradle. Through the frost-covered glass, she saw thick black clouds billowing up from the direction of the south pasture. The barn was burning. "Luke," she called out, her voice tight with fear. "Fire." Boot heels thundered across the wooden floor as Luke burst from his room, already pulling on his heavy coat. He crossed to the window in 3 long strides, his face hardening at the sight of the smoke. "Stay inside with Birdie," he ordered, yanking open the door. The bitter morning air rushed in as he shouted for his cowhands. "Tom, Jake." Fire at the barn. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter and lifted Birdie from her cradle, holding the baby close as she watched through the window. Luke and his men raced toward the burning barn on horseback, their figures dark against the snow. The flames had already taken hold of the roof, sending sparks spinning up into the dawn sky. Inside the house, Clara paced, whispering prayers as she cradled Birdie. "Lord, keep them safe. Protect the animals. Please, please let them all be all right." Through the window, she could see the men working frantically to drive the cattle from the burning structure. The animals were panicked, their bellowing carrying across the frozen pasture as Luke and his hands urged them to safety. The crack and roar of the fire seemed to fill the whole world. A massive beam gave way with a sound like thunder. Clara gasped as part of the roof collapsed inward, sending up a fresh torrent of flames and smoke. But Luke and his men had managed to get most of the herd clear. They continued working, leading the last few frightened cattle away from the inferno, as the fire began to die down. Leaving the barn a smoldering skeleton against the morning sky, Clara noticed a rider approaching from the east. Even from a distance, his bearing spoke of arrogance. He sat tall in an expensive saddle, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow. Luke saw him too. Clara watched as he handed his reins to Tom and strode to meet the newcomer. Even from the house, she could see the tension in Luke's shoulders. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The rider pulled up several yards from Luke. He was a broad-shouldered man in a fine wool coat. The syndicate's foreman, Clara realized. His voice carried clearly across the snow. "Shame about your barn, Harlan," he drawled, adjusting his leather gloves. "Accidents happen mighty easy in this weather." "This was no accident," Luke growled. His whole body seemed to vibrate with barely contained fury. The foreman's smile was cold as the morning frost. "Consider it a friendly warning. You've got until week's end to clear out. Take your half-breed brat and that woman you've been keeping, and go. Otherwise, ... He gestured at the smoking ruins of the barn. "Next time, it won't just be the barn that burns." Clara saw Luke's right hand twitch toward where his pistol would normally ride. Her heart lurched. Without thinking, she shifted Birdie to one arm and tapped urgently on the window pane. The sharp sound carried across the yard. Luke's head turned slightly at the noise. Their eyes met through the glass. Clara shook her head once, pleading silently. After a long moment, his hands slowly unclenched. The foreman watched this exchange with obvious amusement. He hawked and spat into the snow at Luke's feet. "Week's end, Harlan. Toned. Make us come back." Wheeling his horse around, he spurred it into a trot, heading back east toward town. Luke stood watching until the rider disappeared, then walked slowly back to the house. His face was dark with rage and grief as he stepped inside. Clara had never seen him look so defeated. "They burned my barn," he said hoarsely, slumping into a chair by the fire. "My father built that barn with his own hands." Clara settled Birdie in her cradle and moved to put coffee on the stove. Her hands shook slightly as she measured out the grounds. "What will you do?" Luke's eyes strayed to the corner where his rifle stood. "What I should have done weeks ago. Meet force with force." "No?" Clara turned from the stove, her voice firm despite her fear. "That's exactly what they want. Give them an excuse to kill you and take everything." "Then what?" Luke demanded, surging to his feet. "Watch while they burn us out. Let them take my mother's land, my daughter's inheritance." Clara crossed to the loose floorboard where they'd hidden their copy of the treaty. Kneeling, she pried it up and withdrew the precious document. "We fight them with this," she said, holding up the papers. "With the law and the truth. Violence is their way, not yours." Luke stared at the treaty, his breathing harsh in the quiet room. Could hear his men working to secure the remaining livestock, their voices carrying faintly through the walls. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "But if they come for Birdie, ... They won't," Clara said, with more confidence than she felt. She laid one hand on his arm. "We'll find a way to make the treaty work. Together." Birdie chose that moment to wake, her small cry drawing both their attention. Luke crossed to the cradle and lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest. The simple action seemed to calm him, as if his daughter's presence reminded him of all he had to lose by choosing violence. They spent the rest of that long day salvaging what they could from the barn's ruins and caring for the cattle that had survived. When night fell, they gathered close around the fire. Birdie sleeping peacefully between them. The sound of coyotes carried from the distant hills, their cries echoing across the snow-covered land that Luke and Clara had sworn to protect. Not with bullets, but with the power of truth and law. The morning after the barn burning dawned clear and cold. Luke stood at the kitchen window, watching his breath fog the glass as he sipped bitter coffee. His jaw was set with determination. "I'm riding to town," he announced, turning to where Clara sat, feeding Birdie. "Need to talk to Sheriff Keeler about what happened?" Clara looked up, concern creasing her brow. "Is it safe?" "After yesterday, ... Got to be done." Luke pulled on his heavy coat. "I'll take the treaty copy. Sheriff's a fair man, needs to know what's really happening out here." Clara nodded, shifting Birdie to her shoulder. "We'll mind things here." The hand said they'd help rebuild the sheep pen today. Luke paused at the door, his eyes softening as he watched Clara pat Birdie's back. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it unless you hear my whistle." The cold hit him like a wall as he stepped outside. His bay horse stomped impatiently by the hitching post, breath steaming in the winter air. Luke checked his saddlebags, making sure the precious treaty papers were secure. Then swung into the saddle. The 3-hour ride to town gave him plenty of time to think. The syndicate's threats echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of his mother teaching him about the sacred nature of the land. This place wasn't just property yet, was his heritage, his daughter's birthright. Dry Creek's Main Street was quiet. When he arrived, though heads turned as he rode past, Luke ignored the stares, directing his horse straight to the sheriff's office. The treaty papers felt heavy in his coat pocket as he climbed the wooden steps. Sheriff Keeler looked up from his desk as Luke entered, removing his snow-dusted hat. "Luke, heard about your barn. Wasn't no accident, Sheriff." Luke pulled out the treaty papers, laying them carefully on the desk. "Need to show you something?" The sheriff listened intently as Luke explained everything: the spring rights, his mother's allotment, the county records they'd found. His weathered face grew grimmer with each detail. "This is solid," Keeler said finally, tapping the papers. "But the syndicate's got money and friends in high places. They'll try to bury it. That's why I'm here." Luke leaned forward. "Need a witness? Someone with authority when we make this public." Keeler's eyebrows rose. "Public? Planning to read it at Sunday service. Whole town needs to hear the truth." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, studying Luke's face. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll stand witness. About time folks knew what's really happening." Relief loosened some of the tension in Luke's shoulders. "Much obliged, Sheriff." The ride home seemed longer, darkness falling early as winter clouds rolled in. Frost formed in Luke's beard as he urged his tired horse through deepening snow. The windows of the ranch house glowed with warm lamplight as he approached. He heard Clara's voice inside after his whistle, then the scrape of the bar being lifted. She stood in the doorway, Birdie secured in a sling across her chest. "You're half frozen," she scolded, helping him remove his ice-crusted coat. "Come sit by the fire. There's stew staying warm." Luke couldn't help smiling at her fussing. It felt good to have someone care again. As he ate, he told her about his meeting with the sheriff. "He'll stand witness," Luke explained, soaking up warmth from his bowl of stew. "But we need someone to read the treaty. Someone folks will listen to." Clara looked up from where she was settling Birdie in her cradle. "Who? You." The spoon Clara was holding clattered against the table. "Me? Luke? I can't. You can." He met her eyes steadily. "You've got education, proper speech. Folks in town respect that, and you understand what this land means to us. But speaking in front of everyone, ... Clara twisted her hands in her apron. "I've never done anything like that." Luke moved to stand beside her, his voice gentle. You faced down the whole congregation to feed my daughter. You've got more courage than you know. Color rose in Clara's cheeks at the memory. She looked down at Bertie, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. After a long moment, she squared her shoulders. When? Sunday service. 3 days from now. Clara nodded slowly. I'll need to practice. Make sure I get every word right. The next 2 days fell into a rhythm. During daylight hours, Clara helped with ranch work, keeping Bertie close in her sling as they tended to the animals and continued cleanup from the barn fire. But each evening, after Bertie was asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table with the treaty spread before her, reading by lamp, lagged tea. Luke would often pause in his own tasks, watching her lips move as she carefully sounded out the formal language. She took special care with the Apache words and place names, determined to honor them properly. The spring, known as Awakening Waters, called Tout Lies by the people, is hereby granted in perpetuity. Her voice would grow stronger with each practice session, though her hands still trembled slightly when she held the papers. On the second night, Luke found her still at the table well past midnight, the lamp burning low. You need rest, he said softly, not wanting to wake Bertie. Clara shook her head. It has to be perfect. These words there, your mother's legacy, Bertie's future. She looked up at him, determination bright in her tired eyes. I won't let you down. Luke felt something catch in his chest at her words. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his own. You never have, he said quietly. They stood like that for a long moment, connected by touch and trust, while the winter wind whispered around the corners of the house. They were fighting to save. Sunday morning painted the eastern sky in bands of rose and gold. Clara stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, pinning her hair with trembling fingers. She had put on her best dress, modest brown wool, with carefully mended lace at the collar. The fabric was worn but clean, pressed smooth the night before with a heated iron. Bertie lay contentedly in her cradle, already fed and dressed in a fresh gown Clara had stitched from one of her old petticoats. The baby's cheeks were rosy, a far cry from the sickly infant she'd first held in the church weeks ago. Almost time. Luke's voice came from the doorway. He wore his good coat, the one without patches, and had trimmed his beard. His eyes met Clara's in the mirror. You ready? Clara took a deep breath, touching the notebook where she'd copied the treaty. As I'll ever be. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they loaded the wagon. Clara settled into the seat with Bertie tucked securely under her warmest shawl. Luke clucked to the horses, and they set out along the frozen road toward town. Neither spoke much during the journey. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm through the crusty snow. Clara found herself silently mouthing the treaty words she'd memorized, while Luke's hands remained tight on the reins. Only Bertie seemed untroubled. Dozing peacefully against Clara's chest, the church bell was ringing as they approached Dry Creek. Several wagons and riders were already gathered outside the white clapboard building. Clara felt her heart quicken as familiar faces turned to watch their arrival. Luke helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands steady at her waist. Together, they climbed the wooden steps where Reverend Walsh stood greeting his congregation. Luke. Miss Riggins, I think. Preacher nodded, his eyes curious but kind. Sheriff Keeler mentioned you had something to share with us today. Yes, sir, Luke replied quietly. After the service, if you please. Inside, the church was warm with wood smoke and lamplight. Clara followed Luke to a pew near the front, aware of the whispers and stares following them. She recognized faces. From that first desperate Sunday, Mrs. Peterson, who ran the mercantile. Old Mr. Jenkins from the livery. The Watson sisters with their matching BONNETS. As the last stragglers filed in, she spotted Mr. Hanley near the back, his fine coat standing out among the plain Sunday clothes. His sharp eyes narrowed when he saw them, and he leaned to whisper something to his companion. Sheriff Keeler arrived just as the service began, taking a seat where he could watch the whole congregation. His presence gave Clara courage. She held Bertie close through the hymns and prayers, drawing strength from the baby's warm weight. Finally, Reverend Walsh cleared his throat. Before we conclude, Luke Harlan has requested a moment to address the congregation. He gestured for Luke to come forward. Luke stood slowly, his back straight despite the tension Clara could see in his shoulders. "Thank you, Reverend. I won't take much time." He turned to face the gathered townspeople. "Most of you know there's been trouble about my spring rights. Some say the land ain't rightfully mine." His voice carried clearly through the hushed church. "Miss Riggins here has something that proves otherwise, something everyone needs to hear." He extended his hand to Clara. She rose carefully, adjusting, Bertie in one arm while clutching her notebook in the other. The short walk to the front seemed to take forever. "This is a copy of the original treaty," she began, her voice shakier than she'd hoped. She took a steadying breath, remembering Luke's faith in her. When she spoke again, her words rang true and clear. "Know all persons by these presents, that the spring, known as Awakening Waters, called Tweets Lies by the people, is hereby granted in perpetuity to Sarah Whistling Bird Harlan and her descendants. ... Clara's voice grew stronger as she continued, carefully pronouncing each word just as she'd practiced. She read of boundaries marked by ancient stones, of water rights passed down through generations, of promises made and sealed by both territorial and tribal authorities. A murmur rose when she reached the section detailing the permanent nature of the grant. Mr. Hanley stood abruptly, his face flushed. "This is nonsense. You can't possibly." Sheriff Keeler's voice cut through the commotion. "Sit down, Hanley. The lady's reading a legal document, and you'll show proper respect." The lawyer subsided, though his expression remained thunderous. Clara continued reading, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She spoke of witnesses who had signed, of official seals pressed into paper, of sacred trust and enduring rights. When she finished, the silence in the church was absolute. Clara could hear her own breathing, feel Bertie stirring against her shoulder. She looked up to find every eye fixed upon her. Luke stepped forward to stand beside her. "That treaty's registered at the territorial office. Sheriff Keeler here has seen it himself. Anyone who wants to check is welcome to ride over there." More murmurs filled the church, but these sounded different, thoughtful rather than suspicious. Clara saw Mrs. Peterson nodding slowly, and old Mr. Jenkins was whispering earnestly to his son. "Thank you, Miss Riggins," Reverend Walsh said in too. The quiet, "I believe we all appreciate having the truth of this matter brought to light." Clara's knees felt weak with relief as she made her way back to the pew. Luke's eyes shone with pride as he helped her sit. Bertie chose that moment to wake fully, letting out a happy gurgle that brought scattered chuckles from the congregation. The service concluded shortly after, but people lingered instead of hurrying out into the cold. Several approached to speak. With Luke, their manner markedly different from the cool distance of recent weeks. Clara saw Sheriff Keeler confronting Mr. Hanley near the door, their conversation sharp but too quiet to hear. "You did it," Luke murmured as they finally prepared to leave. "They heard the truth, just like we hoped." Clara adjusted Bertie's blanket, her cheeks warm. "We did it together," she corrected softly. "All three of us." The church doors opened wide, letting in a rush of cold air as the congregation spilled onto the snow-dusted steps. Rather than hurrying to their wagons as usual, people gathered in small clusters, their breaths rising in white puffs as they spoke in low, earnest voices. Clara held Bertie close against the chill while Luke helped her down the wooden steps. Mrs. Peterson approached first, her gray hair neat beneath her Sunday bonnet. "That was quite something," Hearing those words read proper, she said, nodding to Clara. My father used to speak of the old treaties, said they meant something back then. She turned to Luke. Seems they still do. Luke touched the brim of his hat. Much obliged, ma'am. Old Mr. Jenkins hobbled forward next, leaning on his cane, his weathered hand extended toward Luke. Your mother was a fine woman, Harlan. Did right by this town more times than I can count with them healing ways of hers. I ain't right. What them syndicate folks been trying? One by one, others stepped forward, the Watson sisters with shy smiles, the blacksmith's wife offering a warm word, even the banker's son touching his hat respectfully as he passed. Each gesture seemed to lift a fraction of the weight from Luke's shoulders. Near the hitching post, Mr. Hanley stood with two other men in fine coats, his face twisted and barely contained fury. Sheriff Keeler approached them, his stance casual, but his hand resting near his gun belt. Might want to pass word to your syndicate friends, the sheriff said, loud enough to carry, that land's protected by treaty and territorial law both. Any more fires or threats, there'll be consequences. His eyes were hard, clear. Hanley's face grew even tighter. Without a word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the hotel, his polished boots leaving sharp prints in the snow. His companions hurried after him. The sheriff ambled over to where Luke and Clara stood by their wagon. Reckon they got the message, he said. Still, keep your eyes open a spell longer. Men like that don't take to losing graceful. We will. Luke said quietly. Thank you, Sheriff. Clara settled Bertie in her lap as Luke helped her up to the wagon seat. The leather creaked as he climbed up beside them, taking the reins. Around them, other families were hitching their own teams, calling out Sunday farewells. The ride home felt different from their tense journey that morning. Though Luke's eyes still scanned the horizon regularly, his shoulders were more relaxed. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered prairie, and the air held the crisp promise of evening. Look there, Luke said softly, pointing with his chin. A pair of red-tailed hawks circled lazily overhead, riding the afternoon thermals. My mother always said hawks were a good sign. Clara smiled, remembering his stories of Sarah Whistling Bird's teachings. What else did she say about them? Said they see true and clear. Luke replied, show us the way when we're lost. He glanced at Clara, something warm in his eyes. Reckon she'd have liked you something fierce. They reached the ranch as the sun dipped toward the western hills. While Luke tended to the horses, Clara carried Bertie inside and set about preparing a special supper. She had been saving a few precious ingredients, the last of the summer's dried vegetables, some salt, pork, and even a handful of dried apples. For a celebration just like this, the kitchen soon filled with the rich smell of stew simmering on the cook stove. Clara hummed as she worked an old hymn from that morning service. Bertie lay content in her cradle nearby, occasionally cooing at the wooden horse Luke had carved for her. When Luke came in from the barn, he paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Smells like heaven itself in here. They ate by lamplight at the kitchen table, sharing quiet laughter over the day's events. Clara described Mrs. Peterson's surprised face during the treaty reading, while Luke mimicked Mr. Hanley's indignant spluttering. The stew warmed them from the inside out, and Clara had even managed to make a simple apple bread for dessert. After the dishes were done and Bertie was fed one last time, they settled in the main room. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Clara sat in her usual rocking chair, while Luke stood by the mantel, his expression thoughtful. Been meaning to say something, he said finally, his voice soft but clear. These past weeks, watching you with Bertie, seeing how you've made this place a real home again. ... He trailed off, then turned to face her fully. I know you came out here for her sake, but I'm hoping maybe you might stay. Not just for Bertie, mind you, but ... double quotes, he swallowed hard. For me too. Clara's hands stilled in her lap. The firelight caught the silver threading through Luke's dark hair, the honest hope in his eyes. Her heart seemed to skip a beat, then settle into a warmer rhythm. "Luke," she said gently, "these weeks have meant more to me than I can say. You. And Bertie. ... Double quotes. She glanced at the sleeping infant. "You've given me back something I thought was lost forever." She met his gaze again. "But the syndicate men are still out there, angry about losing. I think we should wait, just a little while, till we're sure the land is truly safe." Luke nodded slowly. No rejection in his face, only understanding. "Reckon that's wise," he said. "Worth waiting to do things proper." A small smile touched his lips. "Besides, got a barn to rebuild first." Clara returned his smile, her cheeks warm. Bertie made a soft sound in her sleep, as if agreeing with them both. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, answered by another further away. The fire settled with a gentle pop, sending sparks up the chimney into the winter night. The creek's voice grew stronger with each passing day, as winter's grip loosened and spring meltwater tumbled down from the hills. Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the rushing water catch morning sunlight while she kneaded bread dough. A week had passed since their victory at the church, and the land seemed to be celebrating with them, trading white snow for patches of emerging green dot. No riders had been seen on the ridgelines, no suspicious tracks found in the muddy roads. The sheriff's warning appeared to have struck home with the syndicate men. Still, Luke kept his rifle close and checked the horizon out of habit. His watchfulness tempered now with quiet hope instead of fear. The sound of hammering drew Clara's attention outside. Luke and 3 neighboring ranchers were finishing the barn's new roof, their steady work a rhythm that had become familiar over the past days. The old barn's scorched bones had been cleared away, and fresh-cut timber now rose in its place, the wood still pale and fragrant. "Would you look at that?" Clara whispered to Bertie, who sat propped in her basket on the kitchen table. "Your papa's got himself quite a crew out there." The baby gurgled in response, her small fists waving. At 4 months old, she had grown plump and strong, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and lifted Bertie up, pressing a kiss to her warm cheek. "Shall we take them some water? I reckon they could use a break." Outside, the spring air held a gentle warmth. Clara settled Bertie on a quilt in a sunny patch of grass, then carried a bucket of fresh well water and tin cups to the workers. Luke climbed down from the roof to help serve his neighbors, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sawdust in his dark hair. "Much obliged, Clara," old Mr. Thompson said, accepting a cup. "Barn's coming along fine. Be done by sundown, I expect." "Wouldn't be half so far along without your help," Luke replied. "All of you." The other men, Peterson's grown sons from the next ranch over, nodded their thanks for the water. They had shown up 3 days ago with tools and willing hands, saying simply that neighbors helped neighbors. It was the way things should be. While the men returned to work, Clara turned her attention to the small plot she had marked out for a kitchen garden. The soil was still cold but workable. She had been preparing it bit by bit, working manure from the chicken coop into the dark earth. Now she knelt in the dirt, Bertie watching from her quilt, and began planting the seeds she had carefully saved. From her boarding house window, box hardy herbs, early lettuce, climbing peas. The afternoon passed in peaceful industry. Clara paused often in her gardening to play with Bertie, holding the baby up to feel the breeze on her face, or showing her a shiny pebble found in the soil. The infant's laughter mingled with the sound of hammering and the creek's steady rush. As the sun began to sink, the neighbors bid farewell, riding off toward their own suppers. Luke stood admiring the finished barn, his hands on his hips, satisfaction plain on his face. The new structure stood straight and true, ready to shelter horses and hay through whatever weather might come. "Looks right fine," Clara called from where she was gathering up Bertie's quilt. Luke turned toward them, something hidden behind his back. "Got something to show you both," he said, a hint of nervousness in his smile. "Been working on it during odd moments." From behind his back, he produced a rocking chair, not rough-hewn like most frontier furniture, but carefully crafted with a graceful back and smooth armrests. The wood had been sanded satin smooth and rubbed with oil until it glowed in the evening light. Clara breathed, touching the curved back. "It's beautiful." "Thought you might like a proper place to sit with Bertie," he said softly. "Out here on the porch, where you can watch the sunset and smell them flowers you're planning to grow." Clara's heart swelled as she settled into the chair, its gentle rock perfectly balanced. Luke placed Bertie in her arms, then leaned against the porch post, watching them with warm eyes. The sun painted the western sky in shades of rose and gold, while the evening breeze carried the scent of warm earth and new grass. Bertie snuggled against Clara's chest, her small fingers curled around a fold of calico dress. Everything felt right, as if the pieces of a scattered puzzle had finally found their proper places. Luke cleared his throat. "Been doing some thinking," he said quietly, "about what you said last week, about waiting until things were safe." He straightened up, facing her fully. "Reckon they are now. Syndicates back down, barns rebuilt, springs coming on strong." His voice grew softer. "And I find myself not wanting to wait another day to make this proper." Clara's breath caught as Luke knelt beside the rocking chair, taking her free hand in his work-roughened one. "The circuit preacher's due through next week," he said. "I'm asking if you'll marry me then. Clara May Riggins. Make this family we found official in the eyes of God and everyone." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." Luke's answering smile could have outshone the sunset. He leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, then one to Bertie's dark curls. The baby cooed, reaching up to pat his cheek with a tiny hand. They sat together on the porch until the first stars appeared, watching the sky fade to purple while the evening breeze played in the new gardens turned earth. The creek sang its spring song in the gathering dusk, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out to welcome the night. Clara rocked gently, holding Bertie close while Luke's hand rested warm and sure on her shoulder. The future stretched before them like the vast prairie wide open and full of promise, ready to bloom on a warm April afternoon. Sunlight painted golden patterns across the ranch house porch where Preacher Williams stood before Luke and Clara. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh turned earth and early wildflowers. Little Bertie, her dark curls dancing in the wind, clung to the folds of Clara's cream-colored skirt, peering up at the small gathering with curious eyes. The preacher's words rang clear in the spring air as Luke and Clara exchanged their vows. Their rings were simple brass bands, burnished bright against their work-worn hands. Clara's voice trembled with joy as she promised to love and cherish, while Luke's deep tones carried across the yard, steady and sure. Afterward, neighbors gathered around long tables set with fresh-baked bread, roasted beef, and pies of every kind. Laughter and conversation filled the ranch with warmth it hadn't known since before Bertie's birth. Children played tag between the adults' legs while plates were passed and stories shared. As evening settled over the land, Clara sat in her rocking chair, Bertie sleeping peacefully in her arms. Luke's strong arm draped around her shoulders, and she leaned into his embrace, looking out at the lilac sky slowly filling with stars. Clara remembered that cold Sunday when she'd first nursed Bertie in the church. She smiled, understanding now that God had been leading her home all along. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.